Hey everyone, before we get into this topic, I want to make one thing clear. What I'm sharing here is a perspective, not an absolute rulebook for understanding avoidant people or relationships. Human beings are far too complicated for everything to fit into neat categories. So whatever you hear from me, including this video, take it thoughtfully and use your own judgment. Be especially careful with content that presents attachment behavior as completely black and white, where every avoidant supposedly behaves exactly the same way, or where complicated psychological ideas are explained as unquestionable facts. That kind of certainty can sometimes create more confusion than clarity. You know your situation better than anyone watching a video ever could. So listen, think, compare what you hear with your own experience, and ultimately trust your own judgment. My goal with Avoidant Connection is simply to offer another perspective that might help you understand something you have been struggling to make sense of. So, what can happen when an avoidant person genuinely develops strong feelings for you? One thing that can appear is something people often misunderstand: expectations. When an avoidant becomes deeply attached, they may begin expecting certain things from the person they love. Sometimes those expectations can feel unusually demanding, critical, or even unfair. You might hear something like, "I need you to change this," or "I think you should handle this differently." At first, that can sound like rejection or criticism, especially if you have already been working hard on yourself, but sometimes the meaning underneath it is different. When an avoidant becomes emotionally invested, they may start relying on you in ways they normally avoid. Because of that increased emotional investment, they may become more willing to communicate what they need, even when expressing those needs feels uncomfortable or awkward for them. The difficult part is that their expectations may not always make sense to you. You might genuinely wonder why this particular issue matters so much to them, or why they seem to be asking something that feels completely unnatural to you. But remember that people can have very different emotional needs. Something that feels like a small or unnecessary request to you may represent something extremely important in their internal world. Avoidant individuals can also struggle to translate complicated emotions into clear language. Instead of saying, "This situation makes me feel emotionally unsafe and I need reassurance in a particular way," they may communicate through a practical request or criticism. What sounds like a demand may actually be an imperfect attempt to communicate vulnerability. They may be saying, in their own way, "This matters to me because you matter to me." That does not automatically make every expectation reasonable, but it can help explain why those expectations sometimes become stronger as attachment deepens. Let's use a hypothetical situation to make this easier to understand. Imagine a woman with an anxious attachment style who has also experienced significant emotional difficulties in her life. Maybe she has trauma that she is actively working through, and perhaps she is already doing a lot to understand herself, regulate her emotions, and become healthier in relationships. The specific diagnosis or label isn't really the important part of this example. What matters is that she knows she has things to work on, and she is genuinely putting effort into doing that work. She is not ignoring her problems. She is facing them. She is learning, reflecting, and trying to become a better version of herself. That effort deserves to be recognized. Now imagine that she becomes involved with a dismissive, avoidant man who may not be doing the same amount of personal work himself. Maybe he isn't in therapy. Maybe he has his own unresolved patterns. Yet he still starts telling her things he believes she needs to change. That is where the relationship can become incredibly frustrating for her. She may think, "I'm already trying so hard. I'm already working on myself. Why are you focusing on what is wrong with me when you aren't doing the same thing?" And honestly, that reaction makes sense. If someone is repeatedly pointing out your weaknesses while overlooking their own, it can begin to feel less like concern and more like judgment. But let's slow down and look specifically at what the avoidant is actually asking for. Maybe he tells her that he wants her to become better at managing intense emotions. Maybe he suggests that she should exercise more regularly or develop healthier ways of coping when she becomes overwhelmed. Perhaps he encourages her to spend more time with friends instead of relying entirely on him when she is struggling. On the surface, these comments can sound cold, especially coming from someone who has difficulty expressing emotional intimacy. But the intention behind the request may not necessarily be to insult or diminish her. For example, if he tells her to exercise more, that does not automatically mean he is criticizing her appearance or saying something is wrong with her body. In his mind, exercise might simply be one of the ways he personally manages stress, emotional pressure, or difficult thoughts. So he may be thinking, "This helps me regulate myself, maybe it could help her too." Likewise, if he tells her to talk to her friends about something instead of immediately bringing it to him, he may not be saying that he doesn't care about her problems. He may actually be communicating a need for emotional space while still wanting her to have support around her. The problem is that avoidant communication can be extremely practical when the underlying issue is deeply emotional. They may offer solutions when what you really want is empathy. They may suggest coping strategies when what you are craving is reassurance. That mismatch can make genuine concern feel like criticism. And this is where understanding the deeper dynamic becomes important. An avoidant person who truly cares may sometimes reveal their attachment through things that do not initially look romantic at all. They may begin paying closer attention to how you handle yourself, how you manage stress, how you respond to conflict, and whether you are capable of maintaining stability within yourself. That can feel uncomfortable because suddenly they are invested enough to have an opinion about your life. When someone who normally keeps emotional distance begins expressing expectations, it can actually signal that the relationship has become meaningful to them. Again, that does not mean every expectation should be accepted, and it certainly does not mean you should change yourself simply to keep someone interested. Healthy relationships require mutual accountability. But it is worth recognizing that increased expectations can sometimes come from increased emotional reliance. The avoidant may finally care enough to risk telling you what they need, even if their delivery is clumsy. There is another important layer here. When an avoidant person becomes deeply attached, they may begin unconsciously testing whether the relationship can handle honesty. They may reveal preferences, boundaries, frustrations, or needs that they would normally keep hidden from someone they are not emotionally invested in. This can create tension because the person receiving those comments may interpret them as, "You're not good enough for me." But the avoidant may actually be trying to determine whether the relationship can accommodate two separate people with different needs. They may not have the emotional vocabulary to explain this clearly. So instead of saying, "I love you, and because you're important to me, I'm trying to figure out whether we can build something sustainable together," they may simply focus on the behavior they want changed. The result is often confusing. The deeper emotional meaning gets lost behind the practical request, leaving the other person feeling criticized when the actual issue may be attachment, dependence, fear, and vulnerability. This is also why context matters so much. You cannot take one behavior from an avoidant person and automatically decide what it means. If someone tells you to work on yourself, that could come from genuine care, incompatibility, control, frustration, projection, or several things at once. The surrounding relationship matters. Are they also willing to look at themselves? Do they listen when you express your needs? Can they accept feedback without becoming defensive? Are they making room for your emotions while asking you to manage them responsibly? Those questions tell you far more than the simple fact that they made a request. An avoidant person being deeply attached does not suddenly make them emotionally perfect. They can love you and still communicate poorly. They can care about you and still have unrealistic expectations. They can want closeness while simultaneously being frightened by the vulnerability that closeness creates. So if you find yourself in a situation like this, don't immediately assume that every criticism means the avoidant has stopped loving you. But also don't convince yourself that every criticism is proof of deep love. Both extremes can lead you away from reality. Look at the entire pattern. If they are becoming more honest, more involved, more attentive, and more willing to reveal what they need, there may be genuine emotional investment underneath their behavior. At the same time, you deserve reciprocity. You should not have to constantly prove your worth, repair yourself according to someone else's standards, or carry all the responsibility for making the relationship work. Love should create room for both people to grow. If an avoidant truly cares about building something with you, eventually their expectations need to be accompanied by their own willingness to reflect, communicate, and take responsibility. That is where emotional connection begins to become something much healthier than simply chasing someone who keeps moving away. When an avoidant tells you, "I need you to handle your emotions on your own," or says, "I want you to make your own decisions because I don't want to be responsible for deciding everything for you," it can sound incredibly cold. But that statement does not necessarily mean they believe something is wrong with you. If you're already going to therapy, working through your past, learning about yourself, or doing whatever helps you become healthier emotionally, that's a positive thing. But that may not even be what they're focused on. They may already like you exactly as you are. The deeper concern can be whether the relationship will become emotionally overwhelming for them over time. They may worry that if you constantly depend on them to regulate your emotions, eventually they'll feel trapped and start withdrawing. Their request may actually come from wanting the relationship to survive. Think about what they're really communicating underneath the words. They may be saying, "I want us to have a future, and I need both of us to be capable of standing on our own emotionally." That is very different from saying, "You're broken and you need to become somebody else." The distinction matters. Sometimes an avoidance request sounds like criticism because they are not particularly skilled at wrapping emotional needs in soft language. They may focus on independence because independence makes them feel safe. If they care about you deeply, they may actually want to prevent a situation where emotional dependence eventually becomes so intense that they feel they have no choice but to escape. So while their delivery may be frustrating, the underlying motivation can sometimes be preservation rather than rejection. They're essentially trying to create conditions where closeness feels sustainable instead of something that eventually overwhelms them. Now let's turn the situation around because this becomes much easier to understand when you look at it from the other side. Imagine that you tell your avoidant partner, "I need you to be more affectionate with me." Why are you asking for that? You're probably not saying they're a bad person or that they are incapable of functioning without affection. You're saying it because the lack of affection affects your emotional experience of the relationship. You might think, "If you never hug me, kiss me, reassure me, or show me warmth, I'm eventually going to feel disconnected from you." Maybe you'll start wondering whether you're loved enough. Maybe you'll become insecure about your place in the relationship. Maybe you'll eventually seek emotional closeness somewhere else because you're starving for something you aren't receiving. So your request is not necessarily an accusation. You're communicating a condition you believe is necessary for the relationship to remain healthy for you. That is essentially what the avoidant may be doing when they ask you to become more emotionally self-reliant. This is why these requests can actually be positive, even when they don't feel good to hear. They may be communicating, "If we're going to build something lasting, this is something I need." That does not mean you have to automatically agree with every request. You still need to decide whether what they're asking is reasonable, healthy, and compatible with who you are. But there is an important difference between someone telling you what they need because they are invested in the relationship and someone criticizing you because they simply don't value you. When an avoidant starts communicating standards, needs, and expectations, it can indicate that they are thinking beyond the immediate moment. They're considering what it would take for the relationship to continue. And if both people are willing to meet each other halfway, that can create surprising stability. You work on what they need, they work on what you need, and neither person has to completely abandon themselves to keep the relationship alive. Another behavior that can be confusing is what I would describe as an avoidant tolerating you. I don't particularly love that word, but I'm using it because sometimes that is genuinely how they experience their own behavior. They may look at what they are doing for you and think, "I would never put up with this from most people." And when they say that out loud, it can sound incredibly insulting. So let's make this concrete with an example. Imagine a man around 40 years old who has spent a significant amount of time alone. Maybe he has not seriously dated anyone for 5 years. He's become comfortable with his independence. He has his routines, his personal space, his own way of living, and he doesn't necessarily feel like something is missing every single day. Then you enter his life, and suddenly he is allowing someone into a space he has protected for years. Now imagine that you have an awful day. You're overwhelmed, you're emotional, and you need someone to listen. You call him and spend an hour talking about everything that happened. Maybe you're crying, venting, asking him to change certain things, or simply trying to process what you're feeling. He listens, but eventually he becomes frustrated. He might say something like, "Do you realize how much I put up with for you? I wouldn't accept this from anyone else." Hearing that could immediately trigger your anxiety. You might think, "He's tired of me. He's rejecting me. He's telling me I'm too much. He's probably going to leave." And depending on his tone, you may have every reason to feel hurt by the way he expressed himself. He could absolutely communicate it with more kindness, but underneath the clumsy delivery, there may be another message entirely. What he may actually be trying to communicate is, "I need you to understand that this is significant for me. I don't give this much time, attention, or emotional energy to just anybody." In his mind, the fact that he stayed on the phone listening to you for an hour may represent a level of investment that he rarely gives another person. He might not understand why you don't automatically recognize that. So instead of saying, "You matter enough to me that I'm willing to stay present even when this is emotionally difficult," he says, "I wouldn't do this for anyone else." The words sound harsh, but the emotional message underneath them can be appreciation-seeking. He may want you to recognize the effort he is making. Sometimes simply acknowledging it can change the entire interaction. Saying, "I know this isn't easy for you, and I appreciate you staying with me," may give him the recognition he was trying to communicate that he needed. Remember the larger context of this example. This is a person who has spent years being comfortable alone. If he truly preferred complete independence, he could continue living that way indefinitely. Nobody is forcing him to be in a relationship. He has already demonstrated that he can function without one. So if he chooses to make room for you, compromise his routines, listen to your problems, spend his free time with you, and remain connected during moments that are emotionally demanding, those actions may carry more weight for him than they would for someone who naturally seeks constant closeness. What you consider basic relationship behavior might feel like a major personal adjustment to him. That doesn't mean you should accept disrespect or settle for the bare minimum. It simply means you should understand that people experience effort differently. For an avoidant, allowing someone into their carefully protected personal world can itself be a major expression of attachment. This is where misunderstandings can become especially damaging. You might look at everything they're doing and think, "That's just what a partner is supposed to do." Meanwhile, they may be thinking, "I have completely changed the way I normally live because I care about this person." Neither person is necessarily lying. You're simply measuring effort using different emotional standards. You may need affection, verbal reassurance, and emotional availability to feel loved. They may express love through presence, practical support, making time, listening when they normally would withdraw, or simply continuing to show up. If you only recognize love when it arrives in your preferred form, you may completely miss what they're actually offering. At the same time, they need to learn your language too. You should not be expected to survive indefinitely on a form of love that leaves your own needs unmet. Real stability comes when both people become willing to understand and respond to the other's way of experiencing connection. Another sign can appear in much lighter moments rather than during serious emotional conversations. An avoidant who feels genuinely comfortable with you may become noticeably softer when the pressure is off. You may see a side of them that rarely appears around other people. Perhaps you're walking together and talking about random things. Maybe you're sitting next to each other playing a video game. Maybe you're joking around, sharing music, watching something, or simply doing absolutely nothing important. These side-by-side moments can create a type of communication that feels safer for someone who struggles with intense face-to-face emotional conversations. Suddenly, they may become playful, expressive, silly, or even surprisingly childish, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're becoming immature. It can mean their defenses are temporarily lowered. They feel comfortable enough around you to stop managing every part of themselves. That softer side can be incredibly meaningful because genuine attachment does not always appear through dramatic declarations. Sometimes it shows up when the person stops performing. The avoidant, who is usually controlled, independent, and careful, may start showing spontaneous excitement around you. They may tell you random stories, share things they normally keep private, become goofy, tease you, or show enthusiasm over something that seems completely insignificant. These moments can reveal emotional safety more clearly than a serious conversation ever could. When someone who normally protects themselves begins acting natural and unguarded around you, that can suggest that they no longer feel the same need to maintain emotional distance. They may not even realize they're doing it. The relationship has simply become a place where they can relax. And for someone who has spent years protecting their independence, that kind of comfort can be a very meaningful form of intimacy. Finally, one of the biggest patterns to pay attention to is what happens when the relationship becomes difficult. When an avoidant genuinely cares deeply, they may not immediately disappear the moment something becomes uncomfortable. They may struggle. They may withdraw temporarily. They may need space. They may become frustrated or emotionally overwhelmed. But when the attachment is strong, they often make repeated attempts to remain connected before finally deciding that they are done. That doesn't mean every avoidant will stay forever or that leaving automatically means they never loved you. It simply means that genuine attachment can make separation much harder than outsiders realize. They may give the relationship multiple opportunities because walking away from someone they have truly allowed into their inner world is not as easy as people assume. So, if we put everything together, there are several patterns worth remembering. First, an avoidant who becomes deeply attached may begin expressing standards or expectations because they are thinking about what would make the relationship sustainable. Second, they may give you a level of patience, time, and tolerance that they rarely extend to other people, even if they communicate that fact badly. Third, you may notice a much softer, more playful, open, and genuine side of them appearing during relaxed moments when there is no emotional pressure. And finally, when things become difficult, they may continue trying for longer than you realize because the relationship has become important to them. None of these behaviors should be treated as absolute proof of love, and none excuse unhealthy treatment. But when these patterns appear together, they can give you a much deeper understanding of how an avoidant person may express attachment when words aren't their strongest language. If this helped you understand the dynamic more clearly, stay connected with Avoidant Connection for more conversations about avoidant attachment, emotional patterns, and relationships.